From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm Dan Torello on staff of the Kluge Center. Ted Widmer, our Kluge Center director, is traveling this week, so he's sorry he cannot be with us today. Before we begin today's program, I want to remind you to turn off any cell phones or other electronic devices that might interfere with the presentation. I also want to remind you that we are filming today's program for a presentation on our website and on our YouTube and iTunes channels. The Kluge Center was founded in 2000 thanks to a generous donation from philanthropist John W. Kluge. The center is a vibrant community of scholarship on Capitol Hill. We bring together scholars and researchers from around the world to use the library's rich collections to interact with lawmakers, policymakers, and the public. We offer opportunities for scholars at every level. Senior scholars, postdoctoral fellows, the mic is fading in and out, and PhD candidates. We also administer and award the Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity, which most recently went to philosophers Jürgen Habermas and Charles Taylor in 2015. Our speaker today is Bruce Carruthers. He was here at the Kluge Center this past summer as the Carrie and Ann Maguire Chair in Ethics in American History. The Maguire Chair was created to enable a distinguished thinker to spend a period of residence at the library exploring the history of America with special attention to the ethical dimensions of economic, political, and social policies. We're sorry Mr. Carrie Maguire couldn't be with us today. We hold deep gratitude to Mr. Maguire, a member of the library's Madison Council, for his generous donation to endow this chair, which has attracted some of the best scholars at work in the field and has been a treasure for the library and for the nation. Today's lecture is titled The Economy of Promises, Trust and Credit in America. It's a topic that is the culmination of years of thought and writing for Bruce along these themes. Dr. Carruthers has been investigating how, historically, in an economy that depends on credit, people manage trust and how they reduce uncertainty and vulnerability. Dr. Carruthers is the John D. MacArthur Chair and Professor of Sociology and Director of the Buffett Institute for Global Studies at Northwestern University. He is the author or co-author of 5 books on markets, business, the economy, and politics. His most recent book is Money and Credit, a sociological approach, and examined the social dimensions of money and credit at the individual and corporate levels. 2009 book was Bankrupt: Global Lawmaking and Systemic Financial Crisis. It was co-authored with Terrence Holliday, and it studied how global actors have shaped corporate bankruptcy laws around the world. At Northwestern, his areas of research include the historical evolution of credit as a problem in the sociology of trust, regulatory arbitrage, derivative markets, and the regulation of credit in early 20th century America. Dr. Carruthers has held visiting fellowships at the Russell Sage Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin. He also received a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship and received his PhD from the University of Chicago. So in addition to all this erudition, we can say that we've missed Bruce's good humor and collegiality around the Kluge Center, so we're glad that he's back with us today. Please welcome Bruce Carruthers.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone. I know I'm supposed to stay in one place because the camera's right there and there's this recording equipment, and so I'm going to try not to wander. It's really going to require some great self-discipline. I have to admit this is a bittersweet moment as I'm reminded of the wonderful experience that I had this past summer visiting the Kluge Center, and I'm also reminded that that experience is over. So I flew in from Chicago this morning and had to extract myself from various administrative duties. I am grateful to the entire Kluge staff, but especially to Travis Hensley, Dan Torello, Mary Lou Rieker, and Jason Steinhauer for making my visit so productive and pleasurable. My fellow visiting scholars were a lively bunch who always provided food for thought and amicable companionship. And I would like to congratulate the new Kluge director. I'm sure he already knows what a special institution he now leads. And I also want to thank Janice Hyde, who's here, who served as interim director during my stay. I also want to acknowledge Rachel Linton, a very smart Georgetown undergrad who served as my research assistant last summer. And thanks to you, the audience. You probably have other interesting things to do on a Friday afternoon, but you've given me the gift of your time and attention, so I'm grateful. I promise I'll be done before the World Series game starts. Not that I'm interested myself, having lived in Chicago for a very long time, but I know you are eager to get in front of the television and see what happens. And finally, I'd like to thank Carrie and Ann Maguire, whose generosity created the research chair that supported my visit to the Kluge Center and the visits, of course, of all my predecessors. I have a special place in my heart for people who recognize the enduring importance of libraries as social, cultural, and intellectual institutions. So now let me turn to my talk. So, I'm interested in trust. And of course, this is one of these master concepts that is defined variously, and so I'm going to give you my definition. And it is a definition that makes trust to be a fairly particular kind of thing. And that is, I'm not interested in trust in the sense that I trust everyone or everyone trusts me. It's not so generic, it's not so ambient. Really, I'm interested in a definition or an understanding of trust where it makes sense to say that person A trusts person B to do something, to do X. That is, and when you do trust someone, you proceed with the expectation that that other individual is going to do whatever it is X is. And so this is a notion of trust that is relational, that is, it's about relations between two parties, and it's specific. It's not that I trust so-and-so in general. I trust them to do something in particular. And of course, trust is not the same thing as trustworthiness. You could trust someone who wasn't trustworthy, in which case you've made a terrible mistake. So in pulling apart trust, there's really two features that make it complicated. And I call these vulnerability and uncertainty. And vulnerability stems from the fact that what B does is going to have an impact on A. That is, A cares about what B will do, and if B does something nicely or well, then it's going to help A, and if they don't, it's going to hurt A. So B's actions have an impact on A, and that's the vulnerability feature. But it's also the case that because it's all forward-looking into the future, A doesn't know what B is going to do. That is, there's uncertainty. If the world were perfectly predictable, we wouldn't have to worry about trust because you would know what B is going to do. You wouldn't have to trust them. And of course, with this kind of general definition, trust matters in politics, it matters in the economy, it matters in social life generally, and certainly we're in the midst of an election where the issue of who trusts whom is clearly very important, but I'm going to focus on the economy. So, my definition of trust maps very nicely onto the situation of credit. So if we consider that this party A is called the creditor, and B is the debtor, and this activity is called repay the money. And the definition applies very directly and very simply to the issue of credit. And so does uncertainty and vulnerability. A is uncertain about whether B will keep her promise to repay. So you don't know, you lend the money and you hope they will repay, but you aren't entirely sure. And the lender is vulnerable depending upon the size and the maturity of the loan. So if you lend someone a small amount, it's not a huge vulnerability. If you lend them enough to buy a house, it's a big vulnerability, and so forth. And in moving forward, given this sort of problem of trust, there's kind of a simple recipe forward, and that is either address uncertainty, that is, gather information to figure out, well, what are they going to do? Or manage vulnerability, find ways to protect yourself from misbehavior if that occurs. So very straightforward kind of recipe for mitigating the trust problem. And the real problem is that you can't run a modern economy without credit. That is, this is an inescapable problem in the modern world. Modern economies are built around promises. Lots and lots of people are making lots and lots of promises to lots and lots of other people. And the viability of that really fuels the economy. If no one trusted anyone else, we'd all, we wouldn't even be drinking the water because we'd be worried it was poisonous. And I'm going to have a bit of the water that Dan gave me, and I trust him, and life would be hard if I couldn't. So credit is pervasive, and it's a really practical problem. That is, if you're in the business world, operating without credit makes your life very miserable. But it's also a theoretical issue in the sense that people have thought for a long time, how do we solve this problem? What is the nature of this problem? How can we build institutions that will deal with it? So I've got a nice quote here from Walter Bagehot, who was a very famous 19th century British central banker. He wrote in Lombard Street, "Credit is a set of promises to pay. Will those promises be kept?" So, in this talk and in my project, I'm really focused on the informational side. Not so much on vulnerability, which is an important component, but that would be another talk. I'm really looking at how do people gather information about borrowers to reduce the uncertainty about what those folks are going to do. How do you answer the question, will so-and-so repay the loan I'm going to make to them? And I'm going to focus particularly on the invention of credit ratings and credit scores. And as you'll learn, this is something that was really invented in the United States and now is quite a pervasive form of information. These, over the time period that I'm examining, grew in importance, and they augmented and partially displaced older forms of information, and I'll say a little bit more about that. And as I said, I'm just going to look at the informational side of the problem, that is the part that deals with uncertainty. I'm going to set aside all of the tricks that lenders have for reducing their vulnerability, but just to give you a sense of what such a trick might look like, think about collateral. Collateral is a way of saying, if you don't repay me, I'll take your house, or I'll take your car, I'll repossess your car. That's a collateralized loan, and it obviously reduces the vulnerability because it reduces the losses. So, one of the interesting things about this is that there is some measure of continuity. That is, if you think about and look at how people have thought about the trustworthiness of debtors and how to manage the problem of lending to them, there is some folk wisdom, and I call these durable creditor heuristics, that have existed for centuries. And on the right-hand side, we have the title page of a nice little book that came out of the Bank of Philadelphia that talk about the 4 C's. And if you were a lender, here's a nice handy mnemonic. If you're going to wonder whether you should lend money to some customer, pay attention to their character, their capacity, their capital, and their collateral. Nice little handy memorable phrase. Well, going back to the early 19th century and crossing the Atlantic, in the London Tradesman, which is a sort of a business advice book, you see a very similar kind of mnemonic which says, here are the 4 indispensable requisites to complete success in business: capital, credit, fair character, and connections. So it's a different set of C's, but you get the idea. In particular, there's a lot of interest in character. What is the character, that sort of moral fiber of the borrower? So now I'm going to start to tell you the story of new forms of information that came along. And this very stern-looking man here is a guy named Lewis Tappan. And he was if you've ever been to Oberlin, Ohio, there's a place called Tappan Square. It turns out that Lewis Tappan was a member of a very prominent abolitionist family. So he was politically active, but he also invented and founded a firm called the Mercantile Agency in 1841. And it was a firm that solved a very simple problem. And that was, there were a bunch of suppliers in New York City who were shipping goods to customers, increasingly out of the region, not just in the boroughs of New York, but up the Hudson, and into the Midwest and places like that. And they were being asked to extend credit to people who were complete strangers to them. They had no information about these individuals, these businesses that wanted to buy from them. They had maximum uncertainty. And so Tappan basically founded a firm to say, I will provide information to these New York City wholesalers and suppliers so that they can address this issue of uncertainty and reduce it. And so this is the invention of a kind of a commodified form of information processing and gathering, or gathering and processing. The information came from a network of correspondents and branch offices. So this guy Tappan cultivated a network all over the United States that would gather information and funnel it to the headquarters in New York City, and they would process that information and would sell it to their subscribers. And they would sell it as credit reports and credit ratings. And if you've paid attention to the global financial crisis of 2008, you may have heard of the issuer pays business model for ratings. This was the user pays business model, which is to say the person who was paying for this information was the individual who was going to use it to make a credit decision, either to lend money to someone or not, depending upon the rating that was supplied by Lewis Tappan and his firm. So here's a page from the New York Daily Tribune from 1844, shortly after he's set up his firm and is running. And he's based, this is just sheer advertising, marketing. The modern equivalent would show up if you go to Google, an ad would pop up. But in the old days, you would publish it in a newspaper. But there's, I've got the big arrow there, and I don't know whether you can read it. He's basically telling his customers, here is the proof of the pudding. Here's why you should subscribe to my business, pay for my information. He says, no better way has been thought of this than for such to bring a list of the bad debts they have made since the establishment of the agency in 1841 and ascertain how the debtors stood on the books of the agency when the goods were sold to them. He's basically saying, bring your bad debts to me, all the people that have defaulted, and look in my books, and I will show you that the information that I possess would have allowed you to anticipate those bad debts. If you had come to me then, you would have saved yourself all this grief. That's the kind of test he's putting to his would-be customers. So here's a kind of a stylized network diagram of how this business worked. So in the middle, we've got the New York City head office, and they are still in that area of the country. They had a growing network of branch offices, and the branch offices were in places like Chicago or Peoria or San Francisco, and eventually they went overseas. And the branch offices gathered information from the firms that were being rated themselves. So they would send out people to solicit information from a business. They relied on key informants. That is, there were people who knew what was going on in a particular town. And they also had a kind of a generalized sentiment that they called the trade, which was sort of like, what does the market think of your particular firm, right? So all of those three sources would funnel information to branch offices, and they would pass it on to the headquarters in New York City. They also had a network of direct correspondence, that is, people who supplied information courtesy of the U.S. postal system directly to the head office. Then they would compile all that information and turn it really into two products that they would sell to their customers who are at the bottom. They sold reference books, and I will show you what those look like, and they also sold commissioned reports. That is, somebody could commission a report specifically about a particular business. But I'm going to focus mostly on the reference books because they were the most important of the informational products. So this is a couple of manuscript pages that give you a sense of what this information looked like. On the far right, we've got the mercantile agency, R.G. Dunn. It's the precursor of Dun & Bradstreet, which you may have heard of. And in this case, they've written a letter to a firm and said, tell us about your business. And the person who receives that letter presumably would have submitted some sort of report to Dun & Bradstreet, or Dunn, excuse me, and they would have taken that and coded it in a particular kind of way. And on the left-hand side is a page of one of the ledgers, the sort of core proprietary information that they gathered. And what's fun about it, and let's see if I can get this laser thing going. They liked, as correspondents, local attorneys, because an attorney in a small town knew everyone's business, literally. because if you ran a small business, you would need someone to write contracts, to collect debts. There would be some low-end legal work. And so local attorneys knew a lot. They were a fabulous source of information. And you can't see this. Whoop, I will. Now I come back into the camera. I have just indicated, for the camera's benefit, a part in the page where they identify a local attorney, and this is Sangamon County, which is in Illinois, and there's a fellow named Abraham Lincoln who eventually moved closer to where we are today and did something, I can't remember what. But he was, when on a day, early on his career, he was a local attorney, and he provided information to the mercantile agency. It would go to the head office, and the head office looked like this. So they looked like business offices with lots of clerks and filing cabinets and people running around processing information. Remember, this is the 19th century equivalent of big data. They are gathering information on a scale that's unprecedented, and they are processing it and collating it and preserving it, and then they're selling it again, so they're commodifying it. And it happens in offices like this. The big difference you'll note between 76 and 83 is overhead lighting. It helps when you're in an office to have lights, right? And yeah, and you can see that. Here's a branch office in St. Paul, Minnesota, 1895. One of the things that's characteristic of the mercantile agency and all of these is they were on the cutting edge of information technology, 19th century style. And in the 19th century, IT meant filing cabinets and typewriters and secretaries and stuff like that. And you can see they're amply provisioned with all of that. So this is sort of the site of the work that is being done. It's informational work. So they receive a bunch of information for these multiple sources. They come in the form of letters, and the letters are transcribed into a ledger. And this is a page from one of the ledgers, and this is for businesses that are in Bristol County in Massachusetts. The original letters are destroyed, partly in order to protect the confidentiality of the information sources. So they didn't want people to know who their correspondents were. It all was going to be a secret thing. So to accommodate that, they destroyed the letters, and they would record the content of the information in ledgers like this. To give you a closer look, again, this is going back to Boston. It's R.G. Dunn. It's beautiful penmanship. You kind of can appreciate the decline of penmanship in America by looking at these documents. But they're still kind of hard to read. And so what I've done is transcribe a couple of entries just to give you a sense of what did they know when they were busy trying to ascertain the trustworthiness of a would-be debtor or a small business. What did they actually want to know? Well, here is a couple of examples. So this is the entry for a dry goods firm where the proprietor's name is Nathan Tiffany, and his address is 771 West Madison Street. And if you know Chicago, that's actually quite, just west of the Loop. And I've highlighted in red a couple of things just to call your attention to some of the detail here. The first entry is from October 13, 1873. So when somebody kind of came on their radar screen, they would receive information from time to time, and they would update it, and every update involved another entry. So in October of 1873, they note that Nathan Tiffany has made the following statement. And what this means is they have gone to Nathan Tiffany and they've gathered information directly from him. And he has been cooperative. He has made a statement. Sometimes they would go to somebody and that individual would refuse to provide any information, and they would note that fact. So-and-so refused to provide a statement. And of course the thought there is, what are they hiding? Why aren't they telling us what's going on? But here Nathan Tiffany has provided a statement. He said he was in business for about 4 months. He used to be a clerk for Field Leiter and Company. And if you know Chicago, you'll know that Marshall Field's used to be a very big department store. And in the 1870s, it was called Field Leiter. So here's a guy who's in the dry goods business whose personal career links him to one of the prominent local firms. That's a good sign. That means he may know what he's doing. He has stock of about $1,800 to $2,000 worth. That's the 18C, and this is an interesting mixture of Roman and Arabic numerals here. So he has stock worth slightly less than $2,000, and he has liabilities worth around $300. So it's kind of an informal balance sheet for the firm. assets and liabilities. He owns real estate, city lots in his own name, that are worth about $1,500 and free of encumbrance. So this is real estate that isn't mortgaged. And then they talk about some of the property that the wife has. And then we go to 1874. It turns out he owns a lot in Hyde Park, of course, where the University of Chicago is. And then we go to 1877 at the bottom. I'm skipping over some detail, and let's stick with the red. And here is another kind of telling bit of information. He is an honest, industrious Englishman, close and conservative in his business and not likely to go beyond his depth. His statement is thought to be substantially correct, and he is considered a good risk for small lines of credit. So this guy gets a good rating, right? And he's given a statement, and they have observed to themselves that they believed his statement. Very frequently, they don't believe somebody's statement because they're not idiots. They know that sometimes somebody will issue a statement that's manifestly an exaggeration. So they're skeptical about the information they receive, but they've drawn their own conclusions, and they do this sort of outrageous national stereotyping. So here's the good, honest, industrious Englishman. Thank goodness for honest, industrious Englishmen. So again, here's another entry, and I'll go over this one more quickly. And this is from Peoria, Illinois, downstate, and a guy named John Markoff in 1871. Again, they talk about his assets and his liabilities. He has $1,000 to $1,200 in stock, owns no other property, has not a desirable business location, and not much is known of him here. So there's a little bit of a cloud of a mystery over this guy, and he doesn't seem to be in a great location. And then we go to 1873. They say not much means honest and considered good for any bills he may contract is worth about $4,000. So between 1871 and 1873, it seems that his situation has improved. And then in 1875, we go back to the outrageous national stereotyping. He's a good, careful German, right? So this is one of the things that you do see in the records is this kind of national stereotyping, and it really is a shorthand way of talking about somebody's character. Where do they come from? What kind of a person are they? And on it goes. That is not, I should flip back, this is the proprietary information that they did not share with their customers. It's what they accumulated, it was their sort of knowledge base, but what they sold to their customers was stuff that looked like this, a published reference book. It looks like a phone directory, even though this is before there are phones. But to blow it up, what you have is an alphabetical listing of firms by the name of the proprietor. So we've got James Farrell, who it turns out is an undertaker, not someone you want to meet. And then there's a score, E2. And so if you wanted to, sell coffins to James Farrell, for example, and you wanted to know if he's going to pay, if he's good on the coffins, then you would look him up. As a subscriber, you'd look at the entry and you'd go, E2, oh yeah, okay, what does that mean? And there would be a key, and that's the stuff on the right. Let me disappear off camera. This stuff here would basically interpret for the user the meaning of these categories, these summary, ordered categories. So the rating process that was happening inside these firms translated ledger information into an ordinal category system, which they then made available to their customers and sold in these giant reference books. What is interesting is that behind that transformational process, taking this very narrational qualitative information and turning it into a score or a rating, there was no method, algorithm, protocol, or procedure. It was an entire opaque mystery. They sold these ratings to their clients, and when somebody subscribed to a reference book, they got these keys to kind of tell them what that meant. And so in the particular example that's probably a little too fine-grained for you to see, at the top is AA. And that means the pecuniary strength of the firm is rated over $1 million. That's a big firm. And so if you looked up some firm and it had AA attached to it, you probably would conclude, yeah, I can lend money to that person. They're going to be good for it. Because AA, it's like AAA with bonds today. It's the highest, most creditworthy category you can imagine. And these things got published. They were constantly being updated. Originally, they were published annually, and then twice, and then 4 times a year. And the wonderful thing about this method is that it was very scalable. That is, you could take this and apply it to a small community or to a small part of the country, but you could also blow it up and just keep on adding new communities, gathering more information, and gradually building an ever more encompassing network of information that basically captured everyone. So here are this little chart gives you two pieces of information about the growth of the mercantile agency. One on the, let's see, it's the lurid purple, I think it looks like, on the left-hand scale, gives you the number of firms that were being rated. And when they started to do rating books at the end of the 1850s, they rated about 20,000 firms. So that's and in this ink and paper kind of method. But by the end of the 19th century, they're well into the millions. Okay, so it's a giant scale. They're providing more information about businesses than anyone else in the United States. And then their firm itself grew, and I used the number of branch offices to track that. They start, of course, with one office when they're founded in 1841, and that's the right-hand scale. And there are a couple of periods where they plateau, that is, they don't expand much. The Civil War is one, the recession of the 1890s is another, but basically they grow phenomenally. So this is a wildly successful business. Providing information about the trustworthiness of others is a great way to make a buck in the 19th century because there is such demand for information that creditors can use to resolve this problem of uncertainty. And it's not a national story. They go overseas. And so this, in 1916, is from one of their documents that gives the branch offices that are abroad. They go into Canada, they go to Europe, they go to Australia, South America. They're all over the place. And just to give you a sense, in 1916, let's see, Perth, Australia, in Western Australia, in 1916, there wasn't a lot going on in Perth, right? But whatever was going on in Perth, you would know about it if you were a subscriber to Dunn's Mercantile Agency. That's how panoptic and encompassing the scope was. So the information, as I said, is gathered and it's kept in these proprietary ledgers, but then it gets turned into a score, and the key evolves over time. But one thing that doesn't change is the fact that the key or the information that gets sold to the customer is always cast as a ordered category. It's always a matter of classifying a firm. And so the first category system, the first ordinal category system from 1859, has at the top A number 1, then number 1, then 1.5, 2, and so forth. So you can see the order. And the meaning of A number 1 is the following: of long-standing good antecedents, business comparatively devoid of hazard, ample means in and large wealth out of business, credit unlimited. So that's as good as you were going to get in 1859. That was just a way of saying, throw money at this borrower because they're going to be fine. And then, of course, you work your way down the scale. And in the late 1850s, and here's something from the Banker's Magazine, it's clear that the larger business community recognized the value here. So it wasn't just that they were promoting themselves and saying this is great information. There were authorities like bankers who also weighed in and said, for example, the valuable services the mercantile agency, has rendered to the domestic trade of the country as a check upon our credit system are acknowledged by the mercantile community. So this is basically a way of recognizing the fact that this stuff seemed to really work for those who used it, this information. So one of the interesting things that happens over time is the evolution of the category system. So the first one from 1859, now we have a two-dimensional category system where we've got A plus on top and then A, B, C, all the way down to L. And then on the right-hand column, you've got A1, and this use of alphanumeric labels underscores the fact that these are ordered categories. Here we've got more ordered categories from the Mercantile Agency in British Columbia at the end of the 19th century. And another congratulatory headline from the Chicago Tribune. The headline says it all: the mercantile agencies, they have grown indispensable to business. So this is a thing that really took off and really locked in to the American business community. And one of the interesting things about it is that although in its origins it really dealt with short-term unsecured trade credit, it gained such a powerful hold over the ways in which people started to think about credit and creditworthiness that it was very natural for John Moody, when he started to rate railway bonds in 1909, that he would adopt essentially the same kind of system. So when we get into long-term bonds, which, as you know, is a very different kind of credit problem, for capital-intensive businesses like the railroads, or for sovereigns, or for any of this other big stuff, it was natural to use the ordered categories. So here we've got John Moody, who started to rate railway bonds in 1909, and I don't happen to have a slide of the 1909 ordinal categories, but in 1912 it's the same setup, and you can see at the top is AAA, and then AA, and then A, very much like a modern bond rating. So Moody basically said, this great system for assessing short-term unsecured trade credit and the trustworthiness of borrowers in that world, I'm simply going to apply to long-term corporate debt, starting with the railroads. And it worked. He succeeded just as well as the predecessors had. And we can move forward in time, and here's Standard & Poor's, another bond rating agency from the late 1940s, and again, you see the same old ordinal category system. So this way of thinking about trustworthiness as somehow involving categorization into an ordered category system really gets locked in and is reproduced going forward. Even as, of course, the world of business is changing, this system does not. And so we have Dun & Bradstreet categories from 1960, and ratings are breaking out all over. So you could find a rating book for a particular firm, or excuse me, for a particular location, in this case, Cleveland. And this is, I just note, is around the same time that the Cubs last won the World Series. Isn't that interesting? Huh, how did that get in there? Anyway, so this kind of thing is going on all the time. If you wanted to sell goods to an individual in Cleveland in 1909, you would be a subscriber to a volume such as this, and you would look up the person's name, and this is for individuals now, not for businesses, and you'd look them up, and they might be given an A rating, in which case they'd be a good customer, or they might be given an F rating, which means not so good, and so forth. There were ratings that were attached to industries, and so here's the seafood industry in 1913. Same story. This as an idiom for examining or for gathering and portraying information about trustworthiness becomes very widespread. So one of the big issues, one of the big mysteries to this project is, how useful were these ratings? They obviously succeeded in the sense that the business of creating and selling ratings spread. But what did they actually do for the users? And here, the credit raters themselves made very strong, but I would say ambiguous claims about their ratings, which is to say, they would insist that their customers will do very well to pay for the information that they were going to sell, but they were a little canny about saying, by the way, you'll be able to predict who's going to fail and who not if you subscribe to our information. They kind of fudged and hedged when it came to that kind of stuff. In another stage of my project, what I did was gather a data set of 247 Chicago dry goods firms from 1879. And what I've done is, and I've picked dry goods firms because these were sort of the predecessors of the modern department store. And they were very heavily embedded in credit networks. That is, they obtained credit from their suppliers. They extended credit to their customers. And so for them in particular, good management of credit was absolutely critical to their success. And of course, Chicago in the 1870s is a booming place with lots of business, and so the population of dry goods firms is expanding. There are new ones being added, there's old ones going bankrupt and so forth. And what I did in this project was to link that proprietary information that you've seen that was contained in the ledgers to the published rating, and then to see, does that predict failure or distress of the rated firm? That is, could you use the rating to predict who's going to fail and who not? Who would be a good risk and who not? And there are multiple rating agencies working at this time. There's Dun, there's Bradstreet, and then there's another one, McKillop Sprague, and they're all rating two different dimensions of each business. One dimension called pecuniary strength, and another one called general credit. So this is what dry goods firms look like. As I said, they sort of, well, maybe you can't see that too well. They look a little bit like ye olde department store, okay? And as I said, it's fair to hold them up to the standard of can they predict failure, because the firms themselves were deeply interested in failure. In fact, the rating agencies became definitive sources of statistics about failure. And here's something from Dunn's Review in the 1890s, where they've published a table on commercial failures in 1896. So they are obsessed with who is going to fail, who has failed, who's going to fail, and therefore saying that their ratings might have something to do with failure if it all works, I think is a fair test. They became the definitive source for failure information. That is, in the 19th century, if you want to know, like, were there a lot of failures last year, you would turn to Dunn or you would turn to Bradstreet. There was no independent government agency, that was keeping track of these things. And so what I've got here are two panels of other media who reproduced the Dunn figures. So on the left-hand side, we've got the Atlanta Daily Constitution, which has written just a little fluff piece, you know, kind of general business news on failures in 1878. And when they want to talk about failures, they simply reproduce the statistics created by R.G. Dunn. And on the right-hand side, we have the Banker's Magazine talking about how you could construct a science of failures. So there's a real sense that there's a way in which analytically we can find out what lies behind failure. And Bradstreet's itself, which was one of the other rating agencies, is quite explicit about suggesting that you could use their ratings to predict failure. And so they offered the following table from the 1880s, where you are supposed to notice that the firms that fail are the firms that had low ratings. You as the customer are invited to make that connection and therefore go ahead and say, aha, I should subscribe to Bradstreet because that will let me avoid the failed firms, because as a creditor, if my customer fails, I lose money and I don't want that. So, but back to my exercise. Here is a massive correlation table, and I'm sorry to inflict this on you. It's late Friday afternoon, so this is the wake up, you know, see who's still paying attention. And really, this is a part of a correlation matrix where I've basically taken my 247 dry goods firms, and I've looked at, for different rating agencies, what kind of a rating they attach to the particular firm across the different rating agencies, but also over time. And there are two features that are worth noting, and I've put those in the title: convergence and durability. That is, although we're not entirely sure what they were measuring, because there was no algorithm that said how you take this narrational qualitative ledger information and turn it into a score, there's no formula there. Nevertheless, they agreed among themselves. That is, if Dunn said such and such a firm has a high rating and is very creditworthy, the other rating agencies would tend to agree. So you see these are correlations in the 0.9 and 0.8 level. That's a lot of agreement. So lots of convergence. People tend to agree on who does or does not have creditworthiness. And it's a durable feature, which is to say a firm that is creditworthy one year tends to be deemed creditworthy the next year. So this is a durable feature, whatever it is. Now I'm going to try to be gentle here, but this is a kernel density estimate. Let me provide a little background. Basically, what we would love, or what the Dun & Bradstreet would love, is for their ratings to be able to discriminate between the firms that fail and the firms that don't. And so what I've put on there is the scale of pecuniary strength, which starts at 0 and goes up to 25, and this is the distribution of firms that are in the sample, okay? So that 247 firms, they were all given ratings of pecuniary strength, and I've simply drawn a chart that shows the distribution over that dimension. And you can see that most of them, they're kind of on the left-hand side of the axis, which is to say a lot of these were small businesses that had low ratings of pecuniary strength. No surprise there. But there's two lines, one is red and one is blue, and that is, yes, they failed, that's blue, and red, no, they didn't. And if measures of pecuniary strength were able to tell or detect a difference between those firms that fail and those that don't, those two distributions, those lines should not be overlapping, and they do overlap. It's messy, there's noise and all that kind of stuff, but there is no clear way in which the done rating of pecuniary strength is discriminating between firms that failed and firms that didn't, of these sample of 247. I did the same exercise for the other dimension of creditworthiness called general credit, same story. There is no way in which this information is cleanly separating out firms by their eventual fate as either solvent or insolvent. So, and I've got a table if anyone wants to hear more in the Q&A. So the short answer to the question of did this information work is no, not much. Didn't do a lot, and yet it succeeded. So there was widespread agreement that the ratings were useful. The agencies were quite equivocal about their accuracy, but it all succeeded despite their predictive deficiencies. So people were paying for information that it turns out really wasn't doing a whole lot for them, at least in this sense of can you predict who's going to fail, which customers are going to, not repay their debts. What was driving it? Well, here what's interesting, there's two other features of this information that I have noticed really were shaping what was going on in the 19th century. This is a form of intellectual property, right? These were for-profit businesses that created information and sold it to their customers. It's a form of intellectual property, and naturally they were interested to protect their intellectual property. So it turns out that a lot of what they were doing in the 19th century was not in the service of accuracy and greater scientific measurement of creditworthiness and tracking outcomes and all that kind of stuff. What they were mostly doing was trying to prevent piracy. They didn't want somebody to steal their information or to pirate their reference books. So a lot of what they were doing in relation to their customers wasn't providing information, it was hiding it and protecting it because of this concern for piracy. The other major legal issue that taxed them was that when you're selling information and when people are making decisions, consequential decisions on the basis of that information, sometimes things don't work out well. Somebody lends money to someone who turns out defaults on the loan, and being good Americans in the 19th century, one place where you would seek redress is to go to court and start suing. And so the rating agencies were deeply concerned about two classes of lawsuits. They were worried about firms that had, who were their clients and who'd looked at another firm that was given a high rating and loaned the money and then they hadn't repaid. And then they basically said to Dunn, you told us that this was a great firm and they're bums. And now I've lost money. I relied on you to give me accurate information, so I'm going to sue you. So there were a bunch of lawsuits that came out of that path. And the other one was the firms that were being rated themselves. Very often somebody would file a suit and claim, in effect, I had a great little business going until you gave me that low rating, and now I'm ruined because no one will lend me money. You ruined me, I'm going to sue you, right? So a lot of work was going on for these two legal concerns that really shaped the nature of the business. So what happens to these ratings for all their wrinkles and faults and curiosities? Well, as I said, they succeed wildly. They spread throughout the U.S. economy. They get adopted by other markets that care deeply about risk, in particular the banks and the credit insurance companies. Other firms whose fate relies on their ability to assess risk and to calibrate it appropriately and to lend to the creditworthy and not to those who aren't. They had a great appetite for this. As I mentioned, the categories were adopted by John Moody to rate railway bonds. The bond ratings were used by Federal Reserve banks to govern access to the discount window, which in the early 20th century was the major thing that a Federal Reserve bank would do for members. Bond ratings were adopted by various regulators starting in the Great Depression, such as the Comptroller of Currency, for evaluation of bond holdings. And so what you see is a spread in the private use of this information and also in the public regulatory use of this information. So for all of its warts, this information gets deeply inscribed into the basic decision-making machinery of our modern credit economy. And going forward to the end of the 20th century, you find bond ratings are used in the over-the-counter derivatives market, which now, when in 2008, where there were those big scary numbers about hundreds of trillions of dollars of value in the OTC, that OTC market is built around ratings. If you go deep into the contractual machinery, you find ratings are there as well. So here's just a couple slides of credit insurance and then how you would use it if you were interested. Here's going to global regulatory standards, the Basel II bank capital standards, and you can see the risk weights go directly off of the ratings that are given, AAA to AA, and you get a 0% risk weight and so on. So this is just kind of bearing out what I talked about. This machinery that was invented to talk about businesses and then big businesses and then banks, it also is applied to individuals. Everyone in this room, I'll wager, has got a FICO score. And that's something that follows you around, and your ability to get a new credit card and the terms under which a credit card would be given you, all of this is driven by your FICO score. It's better to have a high score than a low score. But that was a way in which household consumer credit adopted effectively the same kind of system that originally was invented for small businesses, which is to say, create a rating system, and then credit can go to people who are unknown to you, who are complete strangers. So I'm winding to the end here. So the bottom line of this big historical sweep, these strange changes that have occurred, this form of information that seemed to take over our economy despite its manifest deficiencies, what's going on here? Well, one of the interesting things for me is to witness how soft information is turned into hard information. And this is a term borrowed from financial economics. The soft information is what you saw in the ledgers. It was this sort of characterological assessment of someone, and he just moved in, and he had has a good career going because he learned from the best in the trade, and his wife has got some assets, and he's a good Englishman. All of that is very soft information. It gets turned into a hard score. And that process of turning soft information and hard is being reproduced every day. When your FICO score comes out or is revised, some algorithm is doing exactly the same thing. They're taking the trail of your engagement in the economy and they're turning it into a number. And they're using that number to drive all kinds of decisions that are very fateful for you. So how to characterize that? This is a shift from idiosyncratic, equivocal, qualitative character assessments, which is sort of the old-fashioned way, to this more systematic, unequivocal, quantitative measurement of trustworthiness. Now, this may sound to you like a good thing, because numbers are more accurate and numbers have this sort of all of the baggage of science and accuracy and so on. But in fact, I want to remind you that there is it's much less a happy story of progress. So when all of that massive information gets boiled down into a single rating or score, simplification necessarily excludes lots of information. That is, you may think, oh, there's the cloud of noise and now we're going to have the signal. But in fact, the signal ignores a lot of the information that's contained in that cloud. Got to stop waving my hands here. And so, for example, the relationality of credit. The fact that trust is relational, it's between two individuals, that gets lost because the score gets attached to the debtor. And the fact that how creditworthy you are always really matters in relation to whom. I, as a borrower, am probably more creditworthy in relation to my sister than I am to my bank. If my bank lends me $100, well, I'll try to repay them. But if my sister, lends me $100, well, I'm really going to take care of my sister, right? Because our relation is very strong, unlike the relation between myself and my bank. And that fact is ignored. That's lost in this scoring. There's a lot of ambiguous and conflicting information, and what you get is a very precise, well-calibrated, unambiguous score. You are exactly AA or AAA or whatever it is. But in fact, the real fact of your life or the real fact of the borrower is much more ambiguous. And so why do we make ambiguity go away, right? That's definitely a loss. The information is of variable provenance. Some of it comes from very credible sources and some of it from not. Some of it is really gossip and hearsay. all of that variable provenance gets lost in the score. The measurement process itself is highly reactive. That is, when Dunn sent a staff member to a business and said, tell us about your business, that business would go, oh, it's the guys from Dunn. I better tell a good story. I better make myself look good, because what they conclude about me is going to affect my life going forward. If they like me, I get a high score and I get lots of credit. And if they don't, right? So they would try to game the information, and of course Dunn was mindful of that, so they would try to make adjustments for whether they were being gamed, and so the whole thing was very reactive. And of course the rating process itself was very opaque. We see a very substantial increase in the scale and scope of this information system, and one of the reasons that we use it today is because it has this strong affinity with algorithmic decision making. And you can see that in the early 20th century in the way in which credit insurance is priced, but the fact that you can go online and enter your Social Security number and someone can link that to your FICO score and in 30 seconds give you a loan, that only works because there is a background of algorithms and databases that can construct a simple rule, that the algorithm will say, spit out a yes or a no, depending upon your score, and they'll do it very quickly at computer speed, and it's not that there's a loan officer at the other end of that. It's completely outside of human hands, right? So when you have quantitative information about trustworthiness, you can build a computer program to make the lending decisions that used to be made by individuals. And that, of course, allows you to make decisions on a much bigger scale, to do so much more cheaply, but not necessarily to make better decisions. These numbers are portable and they are used in different contexts, and so now what we've started to realize is how much FICO scores not only govern access to credit, but also govern access to employment. Employers pay attention to FICO scores. Insurance companies pay attention to FICO scores. Your auto insurance may be priced depending upon your score. Landlords pay attention to your FICO score. It's hard to rent an apartment if you have a low score, because the landlord will say, no, I don't want you as a tenant, right? So your fate in many, many different parts of life suddenly is going to get driven by this one piece of information. And as I said, these measures have been commodified, and their legal status, what sort of liabilities and obligations are attended upon them, often drive what's going on with that information much more than their veracity. It's not simply a story of good science and getting it right. It's much more what are my obligations and what are my vulnerabilities. And of course, credit itself remains a very interesting and contentious issue. And so I'm almost done here. Just think very briefly about the politics of student loans. We know that student debt is accumulating. The top right-hand chart shows you the various forms of debt going through the financial crisis of 2008. And what happened in 2008 is that home equity loans went down, credit card debt went down, auto loans went down, student loans kept on rising. And now the burden, the aggregate burden of student debt is very substantial. And there's people there's a politics of that. And so in the bottom charts, we've got some pictures from some of the demonstrations. I love the "You Are Not Alone" banner there, and education should not be a debt sentence, so we know that someone has a good sense of humor, or at least they learn how to have puns in college these days. And finally, it's not just an American story. So although in its origins it is very much a US story, this method is now going global. We know that the bond rating agencies operate globally. So if you issue Greek sovereign debt, you are beholden to what Moodys and S&P think of your creditworthiness. But this is, I'm sorry you can't really read it, it's legible here. This is a couple of recent news items that are basically reporting on the fact that the Chinese government is building a credit system for the people of China that is very much like our FICO scores, right? So they are, as they move forward in their socialist market economy, they're trying to construct a credit system where every single individual in China is given a score, akin to a FICO score, and that will be used in the same way to govern access to credit, but could be used, like FICO scores, in lots of other contexts as well, and so could be extraordinarily fateful for the lives of individual Chinese. And that is it. Thank you very much.
About 15 minutes for questions.
He's got a mic there, so yep.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I learned a great deal about the history of credit, but I'm going to ask a librarian question about the sources that you used. I know the library probably has all these reference books that are done printed, but what about the beautiful handwriting? And I know the Manuscript Division has the Lewis Tappan personal papers. How much is business activity mentioned in the Tappan papers?
So the main source for those ledgers, the main repository of those ledgers, I think there's around 1,200 of them. They're all massive bound volumes. It's the Harvard Business School Library, the Baker Library. And what happened was that at the end of the 19th century, Dunn basically transitioned from their old style of keeping all their information in ledgers to files, in file cabinets. And I don't know who, but someone had the great idea that instead of throwing all those old ledgers out or burning them, somebody decided to give them to a library. And so historically minded economists and economic historians and people like me have been feasting off these things forever. So that, sadly, it didn't come to the Library of Congress, but as you noted, plenty of other good stuff came to the Library of Congress. So I had lots to do when I was here this past summer. It's just that for the core proprietary ledgers, those are sitting in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Hi. I was wondering if I could get your thoughts. I don't mean to go in this direction, but you brought up politics at the end. On like you mentioned the lead up to the crisis. If you thought there was any sort of mismatch or weird dynamic going on, whereby S&P, Moodys, and Fitch were all basically kind of an oligopoly, right, granted by the government through NRSRO status. So I think it was like in The Big Short, you saw where the banks were basically paying. So I think it also goes back to your point about who's paying for the ratings. And then, as you know, in Dodd-Frank, it kind of removed the use of those ratings. So if you could talk a little bit about the issues going on there.
Right. How many hours do you have? So I'll just say a couple of things because really you've opened up a giant can of worms. I did mention that the original business model was called user pays. In the 1970s, the business model changed. So for the bond rating agencies, they also started with a user pays. And so if you subscribe to Moodys, Moodys would send you a reference book and you would use that to decide which bonds you wanted to buy if you were managing a pension fund or some sort of portfolio. But starting in the 1970s, for a number of reasons, one of which was the growing use of the photocopier, piracy really became a problem for the bond rating agencies, which is to say anyone with a photocopy machine could take their reference books and start to make multiple copies and share them with their friends, and so they were losing money on that front. But also the failure of Penn Central was a real shock to bond markets, and Penn Central was a big railroad, very blue chip, very unexpected. And because they'd been given a high rating and because they failed so spectacularly, a lot of investors basically started to wonder, well, can we really trust any of these ratings? And so what happened was a lot of issuers, that is a lot of companies that had issued bonds, basically paid the rating agencies to re-rate their bonds. And the rating agencies realized, oh my gosh, we could have an issuer pays business model, and then the piracy stuff doesn't matter as much, because the person, the cash now comes from the firm that wants to sell the bonds. But that, as we saw in the lead up to 2008, creates a real conflict of interest, which is to say the rating agency, their customer is not the person that's using the information and who therefore would like to have information that was accurate. It's the entity that is trying to borrow money and therefore would like as high a rating as possible. Because if you have a high rating, it's lower interest rates, you borrow more money more cheaply, there's a better market, all that kind of stuff. And so that conflict of interest really reared its ugly head leading up to 2008. And I guess the other thing that happened in the run-up and that really, worried people was the fact that this is an apparatus, and I'm going to stick with bonds and securities like that. This is an apparatus that was developed around fairly straightforward issuers. Corporations, municipal governments, sovereign governments, utilities, railroads, and so forth. But structured finance, all that kind of big short stuff, the CDOs, the mortgage-backed securities, that financial engineering produces securities that are really, really complicated. And there's tranches, and there's, modeling going on. And basically, it's so complicated that the only people that can really understand what's going on there are the mathematicians and physicists who were hired to create them in the first place, which is to say they had a problem of how to market a security that is so complicated, unlike a GM bond, where you kind of go like, how's GM doing, right? But these new securities were extremely complicated and opaque. And one of the tricks to selling them was to classify them as if, to use the same category system that had been traditionally developed for these much more vanilla securities. So a AAA mortgage-backed security, the invitation to an investor was a AAA mortgage-backed security. Well, it's AAA. It's kind of like a AAA, GE bond. So all you need to know is it's AAA, right? It's good. It's going to be a good investment. So a lot of the financial shenanigans and the complexity kind of got masked by the use of this very familiar label. And that, of course, masked an enormous amount of heterogeneity and bad risks. So as 2008 went forward, especially the subprime-backed mortgage-backed securities just plummeted. A bunch of them had been given AAA ratings, which obviously was wildly inappropriate. And as the real estate markets in Florida and Southern California and Arizona caved, those things started to experience default rates that were many orders of magnitude higher than you should get with AAA. So I think, and then people realized, as you finally put your finger on, that this NRSRO status was a kind of a special status. It was bestowed on a small number of firms. And so leading up to Dodd-Frank, there was a very interesting conversation of whether this was a market in which we should have more competition or less, right? More competition means we allow other firms to kind of join in and compete with them, maybe to do a better job. But here that intuition runs up against the fact that with issuer pays business model, they're competing for the business of the issuers. And so, in fact, the competition could drive them to be even laxer and more non-rigorous than the other way around, because they all want the issuer to use them, to hire them to rate the bonds. And the way in which you get the issuer to use your service as opposed to Moodys, if you're S&P, is to come up with a nicer rating, a higher rating for the same set of securities, which is going to push you in the direction of making mistakes and being overly optimistic and all that kind of stuff. So I think it turned out that the matter of, do we want more competition in this market or less, it actually turned out to be a little more complicated than people thought.
We have time for one more question.
You mentioned towards the end that this was a U.S. origin story, and I was wondering, there's been colonial trade, and colonial trade must have had some kind of credit rating system of some sort, and so I'm wondering what they did instead.
So I didn't really emphasize this, but before ratings came along, of course, credit pervades colonial and early America, but there are no ratings. But what you have is reliance on very old-fashioned, social network-based, are we part of the same community? What's your reputation? If I don't know who you are directly, I know someone who knows you. So direct ties, indirect ties, kind of very much a kind of the reliance on existing social networks, friendship, kinship, acquaintanceship, however they're styled, to circulate the kind of information about who's trustworthy. And it turns out that does characterize the United States beforehand, and it also actually characterizes a lot of colonial trade. There are a few more networked businesses than the colonial trade. So it was a small number, of major firms who mediated trade between, England and colonial America. And within that, geographically dispersed but socially compact group, you could actually do quite a good job circulating reputations, and so they really didn't need ratings. It's when you start to deal with a high volume of people who are really true strangers to you that you need to look for a different solution, and that, it turns out, broke out mostly with a growing domestic trade in the U.S., where, if you were a New York City supplier, the New York area, you could find out what's going on pretty easily. But somebody from the Midwest in a city like Chicago, you have no idea what's going on there. You don't know any of those people. They're all strangers to you, and you don't have any direct or indirect network ties into that community. So you're really looking for someone to help you out, and that's why they stepped up. So if you look at the establishment of the railroads and denser distribution and transportation linkages domestically, it really opened up an opportunity for the rating agencies. But the question's a good one. I think the old-fashioned solution of rely on social networks, and because I know you're a sociologist, that probably doesn't make you too mad. That actually works with colonial trade and surprising amount of long-distance trade.
We hope you'll continue the conversation over some refreshments. Please join me in wishing good luck to the Cubs, I think, and thank you to Bruce Carruthers.
Thank you all.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.